Is the United States government manipulating and, even worse, controlling the weather using NEXRAD Doppler radar installations? It sounds like a conspiracy theory until you realize the U.S. government has these installations all over the United States. Watch.
Was Hurricane Helene's path and behavior just the result of natural processes and climate patterns, or was it manipulated? The circular blue flashes seen in this video are frequency transmissions from the NEXRAD network of transmitter installations. All available science evidence makes clear that atmospheric frequency transmissions can and do have a repelling effect on air masses, especially if and when the air masses have been seeded with electrically conductive nanoparticles. The brighter the blue flash from a frequency transmission installation, the more pronounced and powerful the repelling effect on any air mass or storm in the vicinity will be. Where there are no blue flashes, there is no transmission, thus no repelling effect, thus no resistance for a migrating storm. Translation: a migrating storm will be hindered from moving toward frequency transmissions and will easily migrate in a direction with no transmissions. So again, I ask, was Hurricane Helene's path and behavior just an act of nature, or was it engineered? You decide.
Well, the voice you heard there is Dane Wigington. He is the lead researcher and administrator for the website geoengineeringwatch.org. He's the executive producer of the groundbreaking climate engineering documentary called The Dimming. I encourage all of you to watch it. Dane has devoted the last 20 years of his life to constant research on the issue of covert global climate engineering operations and the effort to expose and halt these criminals. Dane Wigington joins me now. Dane, great to see you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Clayton. Thank you for your voice in this most dire issue that too few are aware of. And regarding climate engineering, it's not speculation or theory or hypothesis. It's a matter of the historical record with mountains of documents to back up the fact that these programs have been ongoing for decades.
Ongoing for decades. And I think a lot of Americans are like, this sounds like a conspiracy theory. It's absolutely not. You broke a big story this week that lawmakers who were briefed on these weather weapons concluded that what happened in North Carolina, Hurricane Helene, was engineered by the Department of Defense. Can you elaborate on that?
Geoengineering Watch is communicating with congressmen from the Carolinas, from Connecticut, from Tennessee, and they are all very aware of these programs being ongoing and operational. And I want to delineate here this. There's a very marked difference between, quote, weather modification, which many people are familiar with, single engine, propeller driven airplane with a few flares on the wings. That is not this. With climate engineering, we have, for example, a KC-135 military tanker can distribute 100 tons of toxic material into the skies to seed cloud moisture in a single payload. So they're two very different animals, and the local publicized weather modification operations are simply used as a smokescreen to mask the unimaginably larger climate intervention operations. So, and again, we have, going back decades, congressional documents at geoengineeringwatch.org. One is 800 pages long, outlining the scope and scale of these operations, even going back to the 70s and before, and the intergovernmental cooperation, even between governments with otherwise adversarial relations, is stated as such in this document. Document calls for blanket legal immunity for anyone and everyone involved with these programs. So again, we have film footage of these aircraft at altitude, nozzles visible, turning on and off. This is not condensation we see in our skies. All military tankers and all commercial aircraft are outfitted with a high bypass turbofan jet engine, jet-powered fan. 90% of the air that moves through that engine is not combusted. So we should see, except under rare circumstances, we should see nothing behind these aircraft. And we're just asking people to investigate the data, connect the dots. This is absolutely ongoing.
So let's talk about, I want to talk about Helene in a minute here, but right now we've got Hurricane Milton bearing down on Florida, and overnight we see this small sort of secondary storm now in front of it, almost like a twin storm about to hit Florida. Then overnight we also saw these massive wildfires breaking out in the Tetons in Wyoming. So, you know, a lot of Americans are so frustrated right now. They're sitting there saying, why would our government do this to us? First of all, let's talk about Milton. Is there any weather modification by the government being used or directing of this storm into Florida from your evidence?
Short answer, yes. And if I could back up to why would our government do this? Why wouldn't they do this when, you know, this has been business as usual for decades? If we look at what the Washington Post published all the way back in 1977, that the U.S. military had conducted no less than 239 open-air biological tests on innocent, unknowing U.S. civilians. That's what we know about going back that far. If we look at the nuclear bomb detonations in Nevada, we have peer-reviewed study now to prove that those detonations eventually caused no less than 500,000 downstream deaths from the fallout for U.S. civilians. That's peer-reviewed study. So again, for those that can't imagine that the people who actually control our government, which I would argue is not any elected official, it's those who control the flow of money, this is business as usual. And why wouldn't they do this? Why wouldn't they use weather as a covert weapon of control? If we look all the way back, Clayton, to film footage of Lyndon Johnson in 1962, former U.S. President Lyndon Johnson, 1962, on film, on the record, ranting like a lunatic, stating we had the power to control the world's cloud layer then, 62 years ago, and quote, "He who controls the weather controls the world." So again, this is not speculation. And we have other governments like China openly announcing their massive weather modification operations. And yet if you bring the subject up here in the US, suddenly you're marginalized. That needs to change. In regards to Milton, there's no question it's being manipulated. And there's a global network of frequency transmitters that have a repelling effect on the air mass that is heavily seeded with electrically conductive elements. And if you saw the track of Milton, it got hung up a bit on the Yucatan Peninsula. There's a massive transmitter in Cancun, and we recorded the transmissions from that, trying to bump that storm back onto track. And again, once it gets near enough to landfall in the US, where the NexRad network then becomes the controlling element, we've recorded this again and again and again. Even with hurricanes like Harvey, for example, Clayton, you might remember 7 days in advance, they seemed to know where it was going to go and that it was going to sit there for days. How could they possibly know that unless that's the plan? And we recorded Harvey. We recorded the actual transmissions with Harvey, Ian, Maria, Michael, all these hurricanes and their interaction with the transmitters. This is patented technology. So again, it's not like we're speculating.
No, speculating at all. So these NexRad, we showed at the very beginning here what happened with Helene. When you have these NexRad frequency transmitters, where are these? Are these on military bases, these installations? What exactly do they look like? And how are they being operated? And I guess by whom? Is it the Department of Defense?
What we know from, for example, congressional documents is there are many agencies involved with the overall operations of these programs, but they're all compartmentalized. So the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. There's certainly central coordination for the NexRad network, and that's visible from the manner in which you can see these transmitters energizing. They're clearly completely coordinated. We do have some of the transmitters on bases, but some are not on bases. And it's even with what we think are just new cell towers going up everywhere, we know from those installing those towers that many of those installations have 10 times more power being supplied to them than they need for communications. And we can see their effect on water vapor loops. They are affecting the flow of precipitation. They are absolutely a part of these operations. And Clayton, if you've ever seen the herringbone patterns, the perfectly synchronized or aligned herringbone patterns in the clouds in the sky, if you've ever seen that, and sometimes you can see those in perpendicular directions, and that's indicative of overlapping transmissions from different transmitters. You can't have that atmospherically otherwise. And so we have the entire meteorological community, their so-called science community, pretending that there's all these new cloud formations, that all these anomalous phenomenon we see in our skies are just something new that nobody ever noticed for 100 years. And they name 18 new clouds going back several years. And I mean, the blatantness with which these programs are ongoing is staggering. And people think, well, everyone would be lining up to talk about this, right? The experts would all be coming out of the shadows to admit to this. What happens to whistleblowers? What happened to Assange? What happened to John Carrico, the person who blew the whistle on the illegal torture programs? He's the only one that went to jail for it. So no, people aren't going to be lining up. And we have right now, Clayton, we have an illegal federal gag order on all National Weather Service and all NOAA employees, the nation's weathermen. Why in the world would you have an illegal gag order on those agencies, forbidding them from discussing any of the agency operations?
Well, and Americans sitting there saying, why would they do this? Why would the government direct this into, no, we can talk about Hurricane Helene now, into this section of Western North Carolina? And, if you follow Occam's razor, the shortest, most direct response makes sense, right? And if it's the Department of Defense directing these weather weapons, and they don't want Trump voters to vote for Trump, I mean, maybe that's the direct line here. Why would they do that? Well, would it be to end the wars in Ukraine? Would it be to end the wars in the Middle East? They're going to be put out of business, tens of billions of dollars at stake if Trump becomes president. I mean, is that a leap too far?
No, I don't think it is. I would just simply add that there are other layers as well. So we have Piedmont Lithium in North Carolina that was hemorrhaging hundreds of millions of dollars because of the roadblock of the owners that were not cooperating, did not want that mine to proceed. We have Piedmont Lithium's contracts with the DOD in 2025 that were coming due. So we have the DOD pursuing that lithium. And again, why would we think that this kind of operation wouldn't be conducted by those who actually control the power in Washington? And I, again, would argue that's those ultimately who print the money. And we have other historical records of this, Clayton. For example, immediately after 9/11, we had General Wesley Clark, the former NATO Supreme Commander, with a list of countries that were to be targeted because of that event, a list that clearly existed before that event ever occurred. Subsequently, every one of those countries underwent a once in 1,000 year drought. That's statistically impossible without climate intervention. And to back this up, we have the leaders of those countries, in the case of Iran, on the floor of the UN, stating emphatically, NATO is cutting off our precipitation. And they can see with their weather monitoring equipment what's going on upstream. So again, why would we think this isn't going on? We could go back further to Project Popeye in Vietnam in the 60s, where the U.S. military was so successful at the flow of precipitation over that country that by the 70s, there were international treaties forbidding weather warfare. Not that anybody pays any attention to that. So again, for Americans that think that this wouldn't be ongoing or we don't have the technology for this, it's simply ridiculous. We have patents going back for weather modification all the way back to the 1800s. We have about 200 at geoengineeringwatch.org, 200 plus. It's an extensive list of patents and new ones all the time for everything from hurricane modification to precipitation control to chemical ice nucleation. Clayton, have you've seen how much hail is falling that's the size of baseball and softballs of late?
Yeah.
That's not nature.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. So many people posting on social media saying they've never seen storms like this before. They've never seen, they're filming it continuously for minutes at a time with lightning going off every few seconds. Traditional thunderstorms, you see lightning maybe every few minutes. But for it to be going off, it looks like something out of a movie. It looks like something out of a Lord of the Rings trailer or something like that. So we're seeing all sorts of different patterns, and people are saying that they've never seen storms like this. Are they right, or are they just conspiracy theorists?
I mean, again, this is a matter of the emperor has no clothes. Again,